University and college presidents, members of the faculty, students, and friends. There is a double problem that anyone faces at a moment like this. First of all, he is tempted to tear up anything he has written, if indeed he has written anything, because the weight of the problem with which you as young people and young minds have been struggling seems to overwhelm and overtake all our lesser concerns. On the other hand, there is the other temptation, equally at danger, that in confronting any one of the issues one faces, he somehow may leave himself and all the rest of us less prepared for the next great challenge that confronts us. Paul Freund, the most distinguished of constitutional lawyers, who one of these days some American president will appoint to the Supreme Court, has said that in the discussion of relevance, with which he has great sympathy, what would concern him would be that if he had been taught in the 30s only what was relevant, namely to cope with economic depressions and crises, he would have been singularly ill-prepared to cope with the great issues and the great crises which have confronted him and the rest of us in the 50s and 60s. And yet this is no excuse for avoiding the problems of the moment. And one comes back to this problem that it's simple to issue and to state the major premise, namely that education in this troubled world is in a race with catastrophe, and there is no certain guarantee as to who will win this race. But having stated the major premise, all the minor premises and accompanying points of evidence lie in an area of great uncertainty, the gray area of life with which most of us spend most of our hours every day trying to deal with the problem. I want to say more about the troubled world than I do about education, because there are those in this audience who can speak with greater authority on some of the details, the procedures and processes of education than I can. We know we're in a troubled world, and yet we're not absolutely sure of the dimensions of this world. It's hard to describe the parameters or boundaries of it. Let me suggest a couple of the boundaries that bring us to where we are at the moment. It seems to me we are aware of this troubled world in which we live, partly because the world is too much with us, early and late. The press, TV, the high level of tension under which one lives, the noise level make it increasingly difficult for any of us to cope with the problems with which we must deal. An Eastern senator with whom I had dinner said not long ago that the one person in the world for whom he had greatest sympathy was his law school son, because he said from first grade until the second year in law school, this son had somehow been confronted with the tension of preparing for a world which he knew might well surpass him in terms of his capacity to cope and deal with it. Young people from dawn to the dead of night prepare themselves for problems that make pygmies of us all. I remember applying for admission to college represented in this convocation and symposium, St. Olaf College, 1 week before the admission, 1 week before the opening of college. How many young people face this choice today? And this is but a tiny example of the pressures and tensions under which, from earliest youth to the twilight of our lives, all of us live. And I think for this reason, we all of us find recourse to escapes wherever we can discover them. The suburbs are a retreat in the great metropolitan areas, a place for leisure, a place for renewal and recovery. Try to organize an effort in a suburb to cope with a major social, racial, national problem, and you're all too aware of the desire to get free of it all that hangs over all of us as we try to renew ourselves. Compare the happy hour and its implications with Theodore Roosevelt's injunction to lead a strenuous life wherever one was. Compare pot parties, compare all the mechanisms for easing and lowering the tension. And one has always a temptation, again, to say this fellow in that corner is trying to lower his tension, never recognizing that we're all engaged somehow in catching our breath in a world that is ferociously with us, early and late. Another aspect of the troubled world, it seems to me, is that the age of innocence is gone for most of us. Problems which we once thought were to be solved once and for all and laid to rest are still with us, or if not the problems themselves, at least their successor problems. Somehow or another we've discovered that the number of intractable realities that we have to carry with us wherever we are more than we acknowledged they were at an earlier period in the midst of the age of progress. Each advance brings new challenge. Every trouble disposed of somehow brings new difficulties and issues. There's forever a new context for human resolve. The economic problems that faced us in the 30s have been, except for this vast, newly discovered area of human poverty, have for many, if not the majority of Americans, been resolved. But the solution of the economic problem has brought psychological and human problems of human happiness that are more difficult to cope with, perhaps, than organized society has found these economic problems to be. We struggle with the question of improving opportunities for minorities. And yet these improvements in and of themselves, fantastic in their range, bring new conflicts and problems generated by the heightened motivation and awareness of people that, in fact, they can live a better life than the treadmill of life had earlier indicated one could. We've increased our tolerance for one another, although perhaps not enough, as the Kerner report would tell us. And yet this increase in tolerance confronts us with the problem of the dilution of values and of convictions and beliefs. And this represents a new problem with which to cope. We brought the United States into the world community from an era of isolationism, and yet you today and all of us every day ask the question, on what terms, with what priorities, toward what ends? And these are the problems that stay with us however we live and die. Another aspect of this troubled world worth noting is that the very understanding of oneself and the rest of the world breeds uncertainty and confusion for all of us, as well as knowledge. We know that we know more about the perennial character of the human vitalities and drives and aspirations and motivations of man. But this hasn't helped us particularly, as some of the articles in the popular press or in the more scholarly journals indicate. In discovering the route to happiness, even in a way of life radically different than the way of life that many in this audience recall at an earlier stage. How does one order the new vitalities, newly discovered vitalities? How does one relate them to aims and goals which have something to do with happiness and satisfaction in life? And I suppose the other aspect of the troubled world worth mentioning is that we're not at all clear about how one arrives at understanding about the trouble with which we have to live. Is it through feelings, as young people remind us? Is it through reason, as the philosopher would have us believe? Is it through judgment, as the statesman would encourage us to think? Is it through science, as those who are able from countdown to pick up to program a fantastically elaborate and successful venture in life? How do we come to an understanding and a grasp of the world in which we live? How does one balance the quantity of knowledge on a problem with the quality of it, and move ahead as one understands all of this? And then where does one fit into this whole picture, the notion of faith? We live even in a world of exploding knowledge with a fraction of the knowledge that exists. The reality that we seek to understand always seems just a little beyond the latest survey or the latest bit of data. And yet, this is the nature of life. And how does one come to a judgment on the basis of facts that forever are incomplete? How do we assess, and what is the relationship of that assessment to action itself? This kind of a troubled world, which one tries to box in, but which forever escapes any kind of definition of its boundaries, is a world which is troubled partly because we are all too aware that pockets and areas of trouble and weakness have been rectified and improved, have been corrected in much of our common life. This is an era of incredible success in many reaches and sectors of human life. Someone has said, a student of revolution, that revolutions never take place among people who have had no successes. They take place when someone has had enough of a record of achievement, so he knows what lies ahead of him in terms of further achievement, if only he can bridge that gap. We've lived with a civilization for thousands of years which knew war. Otherwise, we couldn't quote the scriptures we do. We couldn't refer to the historical episodes we bring to mind. We've lived with a series of nations who had a kind of grand irresponsibility, both toward their obligations in the world and toward the preservation of peace. And yet the concern for peace partly reflects the fact that we are beginning to achieve some small measure of success in managing conflicts in the world. Arnold Toynbee projects that based on the recent past, the 20th century and preceding decades, one ought to look forward probably to a period of worldwide cataclysms occurring every 20 years. We've been on the threshold in the past 25 years of such a worldwide cataclysm. And even as we meet today, the seeds of such conflict are present. And yet, we do know more about managing conflicts. And we are aware of the possibility of the fruits of maintaining peace. And this has a lot to do with our state of troubled awareness, a state of concern which was not always with us, and indeed may not always be with peoples in many parts of the world where conflict is taken for granted. We've made enormous successes in raising standards of living. Our problem today, compared with the 30s, has very little to do, for most in this room, with the problem of dire economic pressure. It has rather to do, as our philosophers and journalists are continually reminding us, with the problem of affluence. How do we deal with the increased ability of men to enjoy the better world in which they live? At the same time, we have broadened social and economic opportunity in a way that was almost unheard of at an earlier stage. The Congress, for example, has 9 representatives and 1 Negro senator today. A Negro for the first time sits on the Supreme Court. Negroes throughout the length and breadth of this land hold positions in federal, state, and local government. Negro mayors reign over the destiny of their cities in Washington, Cleveland, Gary, and other major cities. Professional sports employ Negroes as 1/3 of all players in baseball, 1/4 in football, and 1/2 in basketball. And one recalls the experiences of Jackie Robinson at an earlier stage. And yet, in the face of these advances, the median income of Negro families is about 60% of that of whites. Negroes hold about 6% of the professional and technical jobs. They own or manage something like 3% of the nation's businesses. And our task at hand, as long as these conditions exist, is an unfinished business, however dramatic the progress we have made. On the world front, the headlines bristle with pro and con discussion of Vietnam. And yet, every working day of every day of the year, thousands of Americans and nationals of other countries are engaged in such enterprises as seeking to bring about the Green Revolution, increasing the production of food 3, 4, 5 times in countries suffering from severe food deficits, trying to bring us up online in this fatal race between an unbelievably increasing population ratio and the ability of nations to feed that population. In the medical and health front, miracles that were being carried on by a handful of doctors are now being carried on by the U.S. government on a large scale, by the World Health Organization, by many, many agencies all around the world, where once lonely missionaries combined religious and human welfare functions, now a kind of secularized version of this whole undertaking represents America's role in the world. And yet the cancer of an effort like the effort at helping what seemed to be a weak and defenseless country at the outset hangs over us, even as we, in this troubled world, point to our achievements in these other areas. I suppose what I'm suggesting is that our troubled atmosphere has to do both with our successes and our failures. If it had to do only with our failures, we ought to come to our knees, or we ought to, as some of our children sometimes tell us, overthrow the government. But at the very moment of our most remarkable achievements in broad sectors of national and international life, there are areas of equally broad failure which represent the unfinished agenda and make up the sense of befuddlement, bewilderment, uncertainty with which all of us somehow must live. I suppose this sense of uncertainty, if we're altogether honest with ourselves, goes back in part to the awareness that we're mortal. I came across a very charming letter that Arnold Toynbee wrote at the time that a group of his friends were arranging for an 80th birthday party. And he compares the atmosphere and environment today with that of his childhood prior to the turn of the century. And speaking of the period of the turn of the century, he says, we expected that democracy, representative government, would continue to spread. We thought that it was already all but achieved in Germany and that it would soon establish itself in Russia too. We did not, however, expect it to spread to Asia and Africa. In this major part of the world, we expected colonial rule to continue to spread, and we did not feel conscience-stricken about this apparent prospect, because we did not question the general Western belief that non-Western people were incapable of governing themselves. We admired the Japanese, but we thought they were exceptional. We did not think that any other Asian people could or would follow their example. Since the Second World War, colonial rule has evaporated, and this is surely a good thing in itself. I had a whiff of the atmosphere of colonial rule passing through India to Japan in 1929, and I thought that the relations between the Indians and the British at that time were odious. They are much better now. On the other hand, I feel that India is not better governed today, and I'm not sure that Pakistan is. The expectation that the colonial regimes would last for an indefinite period has proved false. But unhappily, the belief that the non-Western people would not be able to govern themselves satisfactorily has been confirmed by the events of the last quarter of a century. We have discovered, meanwhile, that the representative government does not work very well, either in the Western countries in which it is indigenous, and we have not found anything else to put in its place. Besides expecting that the subject people would continue to be subject, I and my contemporaries expected that in the ruling Western countries, the poor majority would continue to remain poor. Those of us in Britain who came from the middle class and had received a secondary and university education did not feel conscience-stricken at the gross inequalities of wealth and privilege. We felt that there ought to be much greater social justice, but we were pessimistic about the prospect of achieving it. Looking back now, I am astonished at the extent of the redistribution of wealth in Britain since 1914. My 80 years, 1889 to 1969, if I could have had a choice of dates, would I have chosen this particular span of years to live in? As a member of the Western middle class, thinking in terms of personal comfort, I would have chosen a Victorian, 80 years that just missed both the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War. But if I had been an industrial worker, I would have, of course, chosen my own 80 years. And I would have chosen just the same 80 years for being a historian. A time that is uncomfortable for a bourgeois is interesting for a historian. I am both a historian and a bourgeois. But I am a historian first and foremost, so I am glad to have been born in 1889 and to have lived on into 1969. Well, these musings, I think, maybe quoted at too great length, are revelatory of the great change that has come about and of the awareness that we don't know what the future will bring, given the unpredictability of past eras of history. Because here was a historian standing in the midst of history who was so colossally wrong in his estimate of what in fact was to happen, and yet at the same time so colossally right. But I suppose all around the world the seeds of doubt take their toll. They leave us with the same kind of uncertainty we have many times in our personal lives. And they have a great deal to do with the fact, as every newspaper trumpets reports of oppression, violence, and strife. They leave us with the open question, is the trouble so great that education and no other approach to civilization is capable of coping with it? Alongside this, I suppose, are the reports of our many unsolved problems of pollution, of crime, of student unrest, and these are on the front page of the agenda. John Gardner noted recently that when the Urban Coalition showed signs of breaking apart in this city, why, it was on the front page of every newspaper. In some cities where the Urban Coalition has made modest steps ahead, the newspapers have been singularly quiet in their reports. I have a friend who was the first black full professor at Duke University in Arts and Sciences. About 2 years ago, Duke University underwent a very severe confrontation between groups on the campus. And a number of students and faculty worked around the clock to try to arrive at some kind of a solution. So my friend, Professor Cook, called a friend in the national TV network and said he thought this was a story which ought to be of interest to people around the country. And he wondered if someone might not want to come down to cover it. The person at the other end of the line said, "Call me back when you have violence." 1 year later, Duke University had violence. The call was placed, and some of you may have seen the nationwide report which went out to the entire country of an open confrontation where this kind of patient process that goes on, I'm sure this institution, every family, every church, had little place in the report. I suppose what leaves us most unsettled of all in this troubled world is the question of our helplessness in the face of certain problems. A recent highly placed official in the Kennedy Johnson administration was asked what was the most difficult experience he had in leaving the government. And he answered that the most difficult experience was that no one ever longer asked him anything about the field for which he had borne major responsibility for nearly a decade in the United States government. One of the reasons that I think we exaggerate sometimes, young and old alike, this establishment notion is that most of us, through most of our life, have very little role in dealing with the nuclear crisis, or with the crisis of unrest on the campus, or with the crisis of dealing with economic growth in the United States. The small role we play is often played intermittently and sporadically, and then we go on to much different tasks, whatever the tasks may be. And it's worthy of note, I think, that both those who are removed from the scene of a problem and those who grapple and struggle with the problem are all too aware at the center of the problem with their helplessness in resolving once and for all the full scope and character of that problem. This should never be an excuse for indolence in confronting problems. It ought to be, however, an invitation to all of us to seek to understand the issues with which men are dealing all along in issues in this kind of a troubled world. I'm suggesting, I think, that what one needs in coping with these crises and these great problems that confront us is the kind of inner contradiction that at first blush, appears in the statement that Lincoln once made, that he brought great pride in his humility to a problem. Someone else has talked about strength and weakness. Someone else has talked about conviction in the midst of the absence of self-righteousness. And I think out of this awareness that the problems we face on many fronts make, someone has said, pygmies of us all, may well be beyond us, may be born the beginning of the capacity and the wisdom and the knowledge to cope with them. Let me very quickly tick off what I see as some of the present crises that bring us to our state of a troubled world, more or less listing them telegraphically for your thought rather than with any intent of enumerating them with any clarity or any fullness. I think we face, and this is part of this troubled world, and therefore part of the world with which educators must deal, we face a fourfold crisis. First of these crises is the crisis of identity. My grandfather and grandmother, growing up in, generally speaking, this part of the world, had no such crisis of identity. They had a task to perform. It was a task which others before them had carried out. There were things that could be done, and many other things which they recognized were in the hands of God. And their confrontation with a troubled world, therefore, carried with it an air of certainty and conviction that was much greater than any of us bring to the problems with which we deal. A friend tells of standing at the entrance to Riverside Memorial Church when Martin Luther King was to deliver his first great speech against Vietnam. And he noticed as they were about to join the procession to go into the auditorium that King's hand was trembling and that he was white. And he said, as white as he could be, and he said, are you afraid? And Martin Luther King said, I've never been as afraid in my life, coming from someone who had been in the shadow of death much of his life, and who feared not so much physical death, but feared the intellectual and spiritual confrontation of a problem that was as great as that to which he was, for the first time, to address himself. Young people face this crisis of identity. We have a middle son who passed out leaflets this morning, and I asked him as he got ready to go to the railway station if he wasn't scared, and as only a modern teenager can say, he said, "You must be kidding," and he meant not that he wasn't scared, but that he was deeply frightened by all the implications of this kind of a challenge. We all of us face a crisis of identity because this is anything but a settled world, anything but a world in which we have answers to problems. Most of the answers we have come unstuck. The explosion of knowledge which has brought us to our present situation has left us uncertain even about those things where we thought all the facts were in. And under this picture, and with the specter of human destruction, indeed universal destruction, hanging over us, is it any wonder that there should be a crisis of identity for each and every one of us as we face the world? Every institution is under challenge. The family, the church, the home, the nation, the world community, and particularly in its peacemaking functions. And in the face of this, how can one pretend to bring great certainty as to his own identity or the identity of his people? Another very closely related crisis, it seems to me, is the crisis of belief. Most of us have lived our lives out between two points of view. One which made too much of the immediately early achievement of ideals, and the other which gave too little credit to that. The whole intellectual contest philosophically between idealism and realism reflects this debate. And somehow or another, between claiming too much for the early achievements of our ideals and ruling them out in the marketplace of practical affairs, we each of us have to find our footing, not knowing in advance where it is that we will find that footing. It's ironic that just when we thought we could live in a pragmatic and realistic world, having thrown aside much of what we had criticized in the whole Wilsonian era, indeed in the whole Judeo-Christian era, we now find that it is the youth themselves who have risen up to challenge the insufficiency of this pragmatic, realistic picture with which we are dealing. And this makes for a troubled world. The third crisis, it seems to me, is the crisis of authority, which permeates all society. The old consensus is breaking down. A new one hasn't taken its place. There are challenges calling for a new and different framework. We found that national security could not be gained from weakness alone. Witness the fate of the Low Countries in World War II, which certainly were as virtuous as any countries which eventually achieved their security, but because they were powerless, were swept over by a much more powerful force. And in the face of this lesson, we said that somehow security was intimately bound up with strength and power. And yet, we put too narrow a construction on the definition of power. We imagined that its military component was its all-sufficient component, whereas power is made up of, as someone has said, of the fist, which is indeed a coercive and aggressive element, a protective element, but is made up of the whole human body, the body politic, which for its vitality calls for strengths that have nothing to do with defense or power in the aggressive sense of the word. And how does one in a body politic and in a society such as ours bring about health and vitality, satisfaction to young and old alike, so that national security can be protected and preserved in this way? And then finally, we face the crisis between the young and between the rich and the poor. One might say equally between the young and the old. The privileged and the underprivileged. It's the ultimate proof of the insufficiency of the solutions to human problems. That what everyone predicted would happen in the 30s, in fact, was prevented from happening by the unexpectedly healthy response of a democratic, free economy. Because Marx had predicted that the rich would become richer within a society, the poor would become poorer, and finally the poor would rise up within every nation to overthrow the power of the rich and bring about social transformation. A moderately reformist movement, the New Deal, came to power in this country as it had in other countries, brought about minimum but nevertheless far-reaching social reforms. And the revolution that had been predicted as following, as being inevitable within the nation, in fact, never came about. So that in the rich industrialized nations, the Marxist critique and the Marxist prediction proved almost completely irrelevant. But on the international plane, rich nations have become ever richer. Look at gross national products. Poor nations ever poorer. Look at national incomes of $50 or $100 a year. And somehow this gap, as it grows each and every year, confronts a set of national societies all too caught up in the immensity of their national problems with an international crisis which could very well sweep all of us along with it in our failure to pay it the heed and pay it the attention that it should be paid. It may well be after World War II we turned too much of our attention to international problems, too little to national problems. But if in the inevitable human reaction and overreaction against a previous posture and approach, we turn too little of our attention to the international crisis, these problems of a growing disparity between rich and poor, between those who can live on their resources and those who must find ways of developing the skills and the capacities to live on their resources, may well plunge the world into a crisis far worse, far more all-consuming, far more devastating, far more total than even the crisis which we commemorate and deal with and try to think about on a day like this. Well, what can education do in this bleak and troubled world with all the problems and all the successes which confront mankind? First of all, it seems to me it can help all of us put our illusions to rest. There are no single solutions or single answers. I serve on an advisory committee with Cyrus Vance, who up until the end of August pressed his claims within the United States government for a particular solution to the Vietnam problem. Then, as many of you know, he broke into public print in September in a very important article in the New York Times. And Cyrus Vance has said in private that the lesson he learned from Vietnam, more than any other lesson, was that there are tides in human affairs. There are moments when suddenly opportunities break open, when for a brief moment what had seemed impossible becomes possible for those who deal with problems. And here again, the whole gamut of human experience ought to let us know that, in fact, this is not so remarkable. If, Cyrus Vance said, we could have produced, as the United States government, the South Vietnamese negotiators on the 5th and 6th of November of last year, the momentum which had been created by the ceasefire up to then, the prestige of Ho Chi Minh and his ability to carry his government, even with divergent elements in that government, the knowledge of the South Vietnamese that in fact the price of the ceasefire had not been as great as they feared, the convergence of a whole series of factors might have led to a relatively quick settlement, or at least a relatively rapid ceasefire and disengagement at that point, in a way that subsequently it became increasingly difficult, as it had earlier, to solve the problem. Now you may quickly say, well, there are thousands of other solutions. And yet for those, including the humane and liberal who grapple with problems, somehow or another there is a moment when everything one has prepared for, everything one has looked for, comes into place. And if education does nothing else, it seems to me, in every walk of life, it ought to prepare people to expect, to look for, and to seize opportunities of this sort when they come. This, again, is the story of human existence, of opportunities seized and of opportunities missed. And if one does nothing else in the process of education, it seems to me one does a great deal if he helps people to know that in fact there are moments in history, there are times to act and times to think. There are times for war and times for peace. And somehow in these circumstances, one becomes better prepared for such crises if in fact the psychology, the spirit that is reflected in this little story I told is built into education. Secondly, it seems to me, education in a troubled world ought to remind us that whatever our resources, including our inner resources, there is every reason to think that at various moments in time they will be insufficient for the crises with which we have to deal. And this makes the moral and spiritual aspects of an education equally important with the intellectual and scientific aspects. This gives a continuing place on the landscape of higher education to colleges like Augsburg College and other colleges in the neighboring states. It prepares people, in other words, to deal with the human side of problems as well as with those sides which can be capsuled into given disciplines or sectors of knowledge. In the third place, it seems to me, education ought to prepare us somehow or another both to live with our problems and to retain an atmosphere of divine discontent. I've known thousands of people who were able somehow to cope with their problems, but who lived their lives out in a rut because of this sense of resignation and willingness to accept, not for a moment, but for all time, half a loaf, the infertile compromise, the easy solution or the unhappy solution to a problem. I've known even more people who had a kind of attitude as they faced the world which said, your problems are easy, my problems are the only problems which are difficult to resolve. Your problems are problems which can be solved very rapidly and quickly if you apply ideals and purposes, which I'm ready always to recite at any moment in history. My problems with my children, with my wife, with my bank account, with my school, with all the variegated dimensions of human life, are problems which, whatever you tell me, can't yield to simple solutions and simple problems. I would suggest that as between both these illusory points of view, there is the point of view which prepares people somehow to keep their wits about them in the face of intractable, insoluble, unbelievably burdensome problems that literally do make pygmies of us all, but at the same time keep a spark of conviction, idealism, hope, belief in a better society and world ever alive, ever burning, ever present as a guide when the moment comes to break through and move toward something better than had existed in the past. If education in this troubled world could prepare one both to understand his troubles and that of all mankind, and to help him also to transcend those troubles, then it seems to me it would have fulfilled its highest mission. Thank you.